Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Homage to the Great Mother, Prajnaparamita. Thus have I heard. At one time, the Blessed One was dwelling at Rajgraha at Vulture Peak Mountain, together with a great gathering of 1,250 monks, and a great gathering of myriad bodhisattva mahasattvas. At that time, the Blessed One said to Venerable Ananda, Ananda, since the perfection of wisdom in one syllable will bring benefit and happiness to sentient beings, please remember it. It is like this. When the Blessed One had said this, Venerable Ananda, together with all the monks and bodhisattva mahasattvas, realized the perfection of wisdom. They rejoiced and thus praised the speech of the Blessed One. Thus concludes the perfection of wisdom, mother of all Tathagatas, in one syllable. So that is a Buddhist sutra. It is only recorded in the Tibetan canon. There's no Chinese version and no Sanskrit version that we know of. And the temptation is to sort of assume that it might have been produced in Tibet as a result, but that's always not necessarily the case. I'm not really aware of the scholarship that has attempted to look into this. You know, one reason it might not have been translated into Chinese is because, you know, it very much focuses on the significance of an alphabet, which Chinese doesn't have. But there are certain kind of ways around that. So this probably makes no sense to anyone, I would imagine. But hopefully it will in a second. But first I want to just sort of give a little bit of background information regarding this sort of style of text, this kind of group of sutras. So we regularly hear this term, Prajnaparamita. Most people say Prajna, by the way. I learned in my Sanskrit class that it's technically supposed to be pronounced Prajna. So if you hear me say that, that's just what I was taught to say. But these texts, you know, the word itself, so Prajna, of course, means wisdom, and Paramita is like a perfection or a completion. And so it usually is perfection of wisdom is the way that it's typically translated. Sometimes you'll hear something like transcendent wisdom. That's a little bit of a looser interpretation. And basically the idea is this refers to a perfected way of seeing the nature of reality. So in other words, seeing emptiness. Seeing things just as they are without adding anything. Like in Uchiyama's words, you know, he would say reality before we cook it with our minds, so raw reality. And it's essentially the same as the idea of the Dharma eye. So Hojo-san often talks about these different eyes that I think are in the Diamond Sutra, which is another text of this group. And this Dharma eye is, of course, the title of the Shobo Genzo. So Shobo Genzo is true Dharma eye treasury. But this word, Prajnaparamita, also refers to a genre of texts, and there are many texts that have this in the title. And there's also a third sort of usage, which doesn't come up in our tradition, but in the Tibetan tradition, it can refer to a female deity. So Prajnaparamita Devi, a personification of wisdom, who's also called the Great Mother. So at the beginning of this sutra that I just read, homage to the Great Mother, Prajnaparamita is how it begins. So this perfection of wisdom in one syllable is thus a representative of this group of literature, obviously. But the one that we're most familiar with is the Heart Sutra, which is also a part of that group, kind of. It's a little bit weird. I'll get to that. But before the Heart Sutra showed up on the scene, and before this little tiny scripture that I just read showed up, the one that's thought to be the oldest is called the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So these texts are categorized based on how long they are, basically. So this first one is 8,000 lines, and there's a 100,000 line version, a 25,000 line version, 18,000 line version, and so on. And this is the one in one syllable. The Heart Sutra is sometimes called the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 25 lines, I think, and The Diamond Sutra is sometimes called the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 300 lines. So it's just a different way of kind of categorizing them. So what's sort of interesting, I mean, there are a lot of interesting things about these groups of texts, but one is the fact that they're basically the oldest Mahayana texts that exist that we know of. So this 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom text dates to about 100 BC. So it's the only kind of Mahayana text group that we have that dates, back to the BC era. Although some scholars actually argue that the Diamond Sutra might be older. We actually have, I think, a manuscript of the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom sutra from Pakistan that dates to the 1st century, implying that it had probably been around sometime before that. In the case of the Diamond Sutra, we don't have any texts that old, but some people argue that based on the style that it sort of sounds like an oral tradition, similar to what people argue with the Iliad and the Odyssey. We don't obviously have any evidence that that was an oral tradition directly, but we can kind of assume that it is based on the way that it's written. So it's sort of a similar argument. Okay, so in the Chinese tradition, you'll often hear of the Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. And this is actually all of these 16, it's not all, I guess it's 16 of the sort of most important Prajnaparamita texts strung into one big thing. And this filled 600 scrolls and includes 5 million Chinese characters. And it took Xuanzang and his team of translators 4 years to translate. And curiously, though, this doesn't include the Heart Sutra. So you would think that that would be in there since it's such an important text in our tradition. And in fact, some people think that the Heart Sutra was actually composed at the same time as sort of a mnemonic encoding for its entire collection. So as a way of sort of helping people to remember its contents. And this is actually one of the original meanings of the word dharani. So we have, the dharanis that we chant in the morning here, but their sort of original usage was this idea of like sort of a mnemonic device, and that kind of developed some more kind of esoteric aspects after that. So one of the reasons that scholars think this, and I think that it's interesting to know because this Heart Sutra is so important to our tradition, and a lot of research has been done on it, including right here in Bloomington, Indiana, by Jan Nadier, who was a professor here. She's now at a university in Japan, but I think she was here when she published her kind of groundbreaking research on the Heart Sutra. Basically, she found that the contents of the main sort of body of the Heart Sutra, where it's saying no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, etc., that sort of whole part, is verbatim identical to earlier versions of the 25,000 verse Prajnaparamita in Chinese. So it seems very strange that if this was an independent translation of a Sanskrit text later on, that it would end up being identical to a text that's much older. And furthermore, there's no mention of the Heart Sutra until the 7th century, which is when Xuanzang, the guy who allegedly sort of translated it, was living. So also, we can note, of course, that this big sort of collection of Xuanzang, so I guess I should back up and explain who he is in case you don't know. So Journey to the West, if you've ever heard of that sort of movie or story, is sort of loosely based on his life. But Xuanzang was a really famous translator in China in the 7th century. He went on an epic journey to India, and I think all the way to Sri Lanka, and visited like tons of monasteries and collected loads of texts and brought them all back to China. And then, fortunately, the emperor at the time, was very happy about this and gave him a huge team of translators to translate everything that he had brought back. So it's a really important historical source for what was going on in India at the time, from an outsider's perspective, but also a huge source of textual material, a lot of which was lost in Sanskrit or Tibetan. So at any rate, so this guy Xuanzang made this big compilation. Doesn't include the Heart Sutra. Also doesn't include the text that I just read, and I already explained that probably never got translated into Chinese. And sort of unlike that, so whereas Xuanzang just took all of these texts and sort of put them in one big thing and said, like, this is the great perfection of wisdom sutra that's got all these texts strung into one. In the Tibetan tradition, they organize them a different way. They refer to these texts as 6 mothers and 11 sons and daughters. And the 6 mothers are the sort of big giant texts. So the 100,000 line, 25,000 line, 18,000 line, 8,000 line, those are the mothers. And then the sons and daughters are the sort of shorter ones. It also includes the one that I read at the beginning, the 1-syllable version, also includes the Heart Sutra. So interestingly, as part of that theory, they think that Xuanzang himself, who was very fluent in Sanskrit, being this translator, translated his Chinese text into Sanskrit, and then it transmitted back to Tibet. And we know this happened a lot, that texts were translated from Chinese into Tibetan. And so, until right here in Bloomington, everyone thought it was a perfectly authentic text dating back to the time of the Buddha, but Bloomingtonian showed that that wasn't the case. Not that that matters. It's still a good teaching, of course. Okay, so anyways, that's just a little bit of background on this textual tradition. And I've never attempted to read any of these really long sutras. They're very, the longer they are, the more repetition they have, basically. And they actually say that, the 8,000 line one was the original one, and then basically people just cut that one up in various ways and added filler in between. But that's, a little bit of an oversimplification. But generally speaking, that's kind of what happened. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in this sutra. So what is this So this is represented by the letter A. Also another pronunciation thing. So whenever you see the letter A on a Sanskrit word without a line over it, that means it's pronounced like if it has a line over it, it's ah. So like mantra is not mantra, or it's mantra. And this is actually, it works really well in English too, because this is the most common sound in the English language, this So I have, I live in America, So we usually represent it with the letter A, but it can also be U sometimes. So we also have like like the prefix un, so un. So that's also this sound, and that'll come back in a second. So it's used as a prefix for negating things in Sanskrit, just like in English. So we have atypical, whatever. Atypical is an example of a negation using the letter A, and that comes from ancient Greek in our case. The native sort of English form is un. And in Sanskrit, there are a lot of examples of this, including some that we hear a lot. So like anatman is a negation of atman. So anatman means no self. It's a fundamental concept in Buddhism. So anatman. There's the word achintya, which means inconceivable. That comes up. Sometimes we hear anyuttara samyak sambodhi. So this anyuttara means unsurpassable. So unsurpassable complete awakening. Ahimsa is an important concept in many Indian traditions, means non-violence. So that's another use of this negation. Akshobhya means immovable. So we hear that as a sort of epithet for Buddhas and Bodhisattvas sometimes. And so when we have the or un in English, it comes from ancient Greek. But of course, we have un as in like unsurpassable, which I said. And Latin uses in, like inflammable. So these are all from the same Indo-European root, ultimately. So anyways, why am I telling you this? So these texts, if you've ever read the Heart Sutra, it's all about negating things. So this is basically a negation. And so there's nothing attached to it, obviously. There's no specific word that is negated, but it sort of stands in for everything. So thus this represents emptiness itself. So this idea that anything we attach to is ultimately sort of, in a sense, unreal if we sort of attach to it as a concept. And this is basically the same thing as the Heart Sutra telling us that form is empty. So we have a letter or a word, and we're negating it with this so form is empty. This is similar and brings to mind, and all these perfection of wisdom texts do this, but they have a corollary in the Christian tradition. So this is called in Latin the via negativa. And the fancy word is apophatic theology. So this is about what God is not. And often this is related to various sort of kind of mystical traditions often, not always. And the idea is just sort of, you can't say anything about God, because to say anything really is to fall short of the mark. So we can only talk about what God isn't. That's very much the same idea as the perfection of wisdom tradition. We can only sort of talk about what isn't the case. To posit anything is to sort of miss the mark. So, how is this relevant to us? This all might sound very philosophical, this idea of negating things, and is this just kind of minutia? In the Hindu Brahma Sutras, there's this line that says, whenever we deny something unreal, it is in reference to something real. And the idea here, of course, being that, in pointing out that things are unreal, we can sort of see true reality as it is. And that's sort of, again, the whole idea of this tradition of texts. We tend to attach to ideas that are, in a sense, unreal. We have ideas and concepts, we sort of transform them into concrete things in our brain, and we think they're really real, and we attach to them, like, my character or personality is a certain way, and if it isn't that certain way, I suffer as a result, things like that. When in fact, this reality is just as it is, so however I am, that's how I am. There's no special fixed concept associated with it. I heard, while I was doing this research, I don't know if anyone here is a Reddit user. I'm not really a Reddit user, but just sometimes when I'm searching for Buddhist things, I'll end up on R Buddhism, which is like the Buddhist forum on Reddit. And someone had posted a TikTok, which is another thing that I don't actually have the TikTok app, but someone had posted a video of this, and it was like a Vietnamese monk giving a little very brief motivational sort of talk. And he said, stress is the gap between expectation and reality, which I thought was kind of cool. I'd never heard the phrase just like that. But, we're always clinging to particular expectations. Again, we concretize these ideas and fixate on them and get attached to them. And when they don't turn out that way, we suffer, we're stressed, whatever you want to call it. So by realizing that, any expectation that we have, because by nature it's not about reality as itself, it's about reality as we want it to be. So in that sense, it's unreal. And so if we can name it as unreal, we're pointing to what's actually real in the situation, which goes beyond our expectations. So in these perfection of wisdom texts, and in this way of seeing the world, negation is liberation, essentially. It's a sort of subtractive method of reaching the truth. I just sort of want to mention here too, because we recite the Heart Sutra all the time, but we don't necessarily study it very deeply. If you've read Hojo-san's Living by Vow, you would probably already know all this stuff. For those of you who have just recited this text and not really thought about what it meant or were confused, I just thought I'd quickly go through some of the negations that we see there. So the 5 aggregates, of course, are negated. So these are the things that basically make up body and mind in the Buddhist tradition. So that's strange. It seems that I have a body and mind. So why is it being negated? So form, sensation, perception, formation, consciousness. Also the 18 elements, so these are the sense organs. So in Indian traditions, this includes the mind, but also eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body. The objects that those things connect with, have contact with, and then the consciousnesses that arise. So in the Buddhist understanding of the world, we have eyes and we have visual stuff out there. There's contact between them, and then eye consciousness arises in my brain. So that's the way things are conceived of. So all of these sense organs, sense objects, and their consciousnesses together are called the 18 elements. So all of these are negated in the Heart Sutra. Again, seems strange. I do seem to have eyes and ears and a nose. Why would that be negated? It negates the 12 links of dependent origination. This is a really important Buddhist teaching. It actually doesn't list all of them in this case. It just says, and our translation kind of misses this a little bit, but so our translation says there's neither ignorance nor extinction of ignorance, neither old age and death nor extinction of old age and death. In the actual text, it sort of says something more like there's neither ignorance nor neither ignorance nor extinction of ignorance up to neither old age and death nor extinction of old age and death, implying that there are 10 things left out in the middle, which are the other 10 links of causation. So that includes a bunch of things that we already negated, actually, because they're the skandhas, the body and mind stuff. So formations, consciousness, the six senses, the contact between senses and sense objects, but also craving and clinging and becoming. These are also included in this list and negated. And then finally, the Four Noble Truths, the sort of most famous Buddhist teaching of all, is negated. So this is no suffering, no cause, no cessation, no path. So those are the Four Noble Truths. So the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering via the Eightfold Noble Path. So again, these texts do this to point out that ultimately, at the end of the day, these are just concepts. If we get overly fixated on them, we're not really practicing right here in reality as it is. We're just thinking in our minds and being cut off from the world as it is. So of course, we, in the conventional sense, we have sense organs that interact with the world and create sense consciousness. But as soon as I say ear, I've created a concept that's kind of out there in the world. I'm not really thinking about this particular concrete thing on my head, So that's why it does this. Okay, so that's part one of the meaning of Part two of the meaning of is that it's, and for this we have to understand a little bit about how Indic scripts work. So the Indic script is not a simple alphabet like we have in English. And it's also not like, so in Japanese they have something called a syllabary where you can write, like every character represents a syllable, like ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. But you can't just say k, there's no k in Japanese. It has to be attached to a vowel. And of course, in English, you can have a k, but in like the Indic script, so Sanskrit and Hindi today, and other Indian languages, you have the vowels, so the vowels exist independently. But then you have like the letter K, but it already inherently includes a. So if you write k, it's actually k. And then you indicate, like if you want to change it to ki, you write a little mark on it. Or if you want to change it from k to ka, you write another line on it. And if you want to change it to ku, you do the same thing. So basically every letter, call them letters, in Indic scripts already include a. So is all pervading in the scripts of the Indic language. It's a little hard to maybe understand unless you see it, but and you can also remove the vowel too. So like if you have like the k sound, or like you can put a little mark and then it just becomes k. So you're removing the sound, but it's always there unless you say otherwise. Okay, so this aspect is more like the positive theology. So now we are talking about what God is, if we take the Christian corollary. We're not negating things, we're talking positively. This is all-pervading. So in this sense, it's like the Buddhist concept of interconnectedness. It's like Indra's net. So we often see Hojo-san draw this picture on the board where he draws a circle and lots of lines to make a net. And in this conception, of course, you've probably all heard this, but the idea is there's this sort of infinite net throughout space and time. And at every intersection of the net, at every knot, there's a jewel that reflects all of the other jewels. So the idea is, we have this one interconnected reality. Each jewel is each sort of individual thing or phenomenon in that reality, but they're all intimately connected and reflecting one another and interdependent. So this means the same thing. So this is both a negation of everything, but it's also an affirmation of everything because it's completely all-pervading. And this is the same as the Heart Sutra telling us that emptiness is actually form. So it tells us that form is emptiness, but it also says emptiness is form. Okay, so Dogen, as you may know, points out also that although form is emptiness and emptiness is form, form is form and emptiness is emptiness. So this is something that he teaches in his commentary on the Heart Sutra. So what does this mean? The idea here is that as soon as we say form and emptiness, we're creating a duality, right? So we have form over here, we have emptiness over here. And because we've named them different things, even though we're saying they're the same thing, they're actually different things on the piece of paper right there. So it's hard to really conceive of them as one thing when you've split them into two. So Dogen says form is form and emptiness is emptiness. So when we say form, emptiness is already included there. It's already in the background. And if we say emptiness, form is already included there without it being spoken. Some of these longer perfection of wisdom texts do the same thing. They say, before doing all these negations that we see in the Heart Sutra, they say that each is not one thing and emptiness another. So an I is not one thing and emptiness another. So they're implying that, emptiness is already included in there. You don't have to add this sort of additional negation really, because that, as far as reality is concerned, is already undergirding it. But what's nice about our text is the avoids this problem. There is no dualism with There is just and it already includes both of these meanings. We don't even have to say is because is so it's actually kind of, once you get what they were going for with it, it's a pretty profound, I think, very simple, very, and again, this Heart Sutra is supposed to be a distillation of these huge texts, right? These 100,000 line texts or more. But this text, reduces it down to a single syllable, which is pretty cool, from 25 lines or whatever from the Heart Sutra to one syllable. So part 3 of and this is just sort of brief, but is also what they call a seed syllable in Tantric Buddhism. And I'm not really sure how this works because I've never practiced esoteric Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. But basically the idea is this sort of, it's kind of a more mystified version, I guess, of what I've just been saying. And actually, not so much in Tibetan Buddhism, but actually in Japanese Shingon, which is the sort of Japanese transmission of esoteric Buddhism, they have this practice called ajikan, which is contemplation of the letter although they can't say they can only say but it works. And in the Shingon tradition, is said to represent the Dharmakaya, so reality itself, and also Mahavairochana, which is the cosmic Buddha that represents reality itself or emptiness. And interestingly, I said before that maybe this text wasn't translated because of the difficulty of doing these transliterating in Chinese because they don't have an alphabet or like an exactly. But in the case of Shingon Buddhism, it was transmitted with the Sanskrit Indic writing system. So we have all these texts from Kukai, who is the Japanese person who introduced Shingon to Japan. And we have all in his hand writings in Indic scripts. And so this was really important for them. I think, and it still is. I've seen some YouTube videos of them sort of, because there's a particular script that they use in Japan now that's died out in India, and it's kind of a cool script. So I've watched some videos on how to write those with Japanese Shingon monks teaching it. Okay, so there's actually quite a lot to this very simple seeming sutra. I think parallels to this text that we have in our tradition. The flower sermon is one that most of us have probably heard about. This comes from the Gateless Barrier, a koan collection. So it dates to about 1036, so it's a little bit late. But this little text goes, once in ancient times when the world-honored one, that is the Buddha, was at Mount Gridda, he held up a put it to the assemblage. At this, they all remained silent. Only the venerable Kashyapa broke into a smile. The world-honored one said, I have the treasury of the true Dharma I, the marvelous mind of Nirvana, the true form of no form, the subtle gate of the Dharma. It does not depend on letters being specially transmitted outside all teachings. Now I entrust Mahakashyapa with this. So this is a famous Zen text. So the Buddha gets up and he just picks up this flower and he doesn't say anything. He just kind of twirls it around. And this one student in the crowd, Mahakashyapa, gives this little smile. I think a wink sometimes, some of the texts. Or maybe it's the Buddha that winks, I can't remember. Somehow the Buddha has recognized that Mahakashyapa has understood his teaching without saying anything. And this, of course, is sort of exemplifies this idea of Zen, and it says it in here, this idea of Zen being a tradition that transmits the Dharma outside of teachings. So as you probably know, Zen arose sort of in opposition to a lot of these Chinese schools that were really fixated on one particular sutra or another. So, you had a school that focused on the Lotus Sutra, you had a school that focused on various Pure Land texts, you had a school that focused on the Flower Garland Sutra. But Zen was like, hey, you guys are too into the books. We're just going to do Zazen, and that's our scripture, basically. But then, of course, Zen people went on to write voluminous literature about not writing anything. So it's a little bit contradictory. So another one is in the Book of Serenity, which is sort of the koan collection associated with the Soto school. And it goes like this. One day, the world-honored one ascended to the rostrum. Manjushri struck the table with the gavel and said, contemplate clearly the Dharma of the Dharma King. The Dharma of the Dharma King is like this. Thereupon, the world-honored one descended from the rostrum. So he doesn't say anything. He just gets up. It would be like if I just came here and sat down and, did the verses and then just sat here for a while and then just got up and left. And this is the first case in the Book of Serenity, so it's given sort of high importance. And there's kind of a funny aspect to this too, because in these koan collections, there's verse, like poetic commentaries on each of the koan cases. So the one for this particular thing is, the unique breeze of reality, do you see? Continuously, creation runs her loom and shuttle, weaving the ancient brocade, incorporating the forms of spring. So basically here pointing out that this silence gestures to reality as it is, which is often, symbolized in the form of a loom, or like Indra's net, basically. But then the last line is, but nothing can be done about Manjushri's leaking. And this, comes up sometimes. Dogen mentions this, and it's a funny phrase. Dogen's leaking, or it's Dogen. Manjushri's leaking. So the idea here is, Manjushri had felt he needed to get up and preface the Buddha's silence by saying, "This is the the Dharma King's Dharma." So the author refers to that as Manjushri's leaking. So he sort of, had the right idea, but sort of failed in pointing it out with words. So he should have been silent too, basically. So I think both of these texts, the Flower Sermon and the Dharma of the Dharma King thing with Manjushri, and possibly even this sutra that we read, might have their roots in the Vimalakirti Sutra. So this is a pretty famous sutra. It's also somewhat early, probably not as early as like the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. But this is also considered sort of a Perfection of Wisdom text. And this, I won't read this whole thing because it'll get really tedious, as these things often are. But I'll read a little bit of it just let it wash over you. Don't try to understand too much, just to give you a sense of how sweet and refreshing the simple is. Okay, so the basic plot of this sutra is there's a layperson whose name is Vimalakirti, and he is super good at teaching the Dharma, and the Buddha uses sort of like a skillful means to get his retinue of bodhisattvas to go visit Vimalakirti, because they all don't want to, because they're scared they're going to get schooled by him because he's so sharp. So the Buddha's like, he's sick, yeah, you should go visit him, but he's not really sick. And they all kind of are like, I think there's like a thing in the beginning about who should go in first, because they're all like worried if they're going to be the first one to talk to this guy. And at this particular chapter, they've gotten into their sort of Dharma duels. And so then Vimalakirti asked those bodhisattvas, "Good sirs, please explain how the bodhisattvas enter the Dharma door of non-duality." So then we get a sort of huge list of different bodhisattvas trying to answer this question. So the bodhisattva Dharma Vikurvana declared, "Noble sir, production and destruction are two, but what is not produced and does not occur cannot be destroyed. Thus, the attainment of the tolerance of the birthlessness of things is the entrance into non-duality." The bodhisattva Shriganda declared, "I and mine are two. If there is no presumption of a self, there will be no possessiveness. Thus, the absence of presumption is the entrance to non-duality." The bodhisattva Shrikuta declared, "Defilement and purification are two. When there is thorough knowledge of defilement, there will be no conceit about purification. The path leading to the complete conquest of all conceit is thus the entrance into non-duality." The bodhisattva Bhadra Jyotis declared, "Distraction and attention are two. When there is no distraction, there will be no attention, no mentation, and no mental intensity. Thus, the absence of mental intensity is the entrance into non-duality." So this continues for multiple pages of different bodhisattvas, getting up and giving their explanation of what the proper entrance into the door of non-duality is. And then finally, let's see, so the second to last one, the bodhisattva Satyarata declared, "It is dualistic to speak of true and false. When one sees truly, one does not ever see any truth. So how could one see falsehood? Why? One does not see with the physical eye. One sees with the eye of wisdom. And with the wisdom eye, one sees only insofar as there is neither sight nor non-sight. Therefore, where there is neither sight nor non-sight is the entrance into non-duality." Okay, so that's like the last normal bodhisattva. And then when the bodhisattvas had given their explanations, they all addressed the crown prince Manjushri. So Manjushri here is the bodhisattva of wisdom. Manjushri, what is the bodhisattva's entrance into non-duality? Manjushri replied, "Good sirs, you have all spoken well. Nevertheless, all your explanations are themselves dualistic. To know no one teaching, to express nothing, to say nothing, to explain nothing, to announce nothing, to indicate nothing, and to designate, that is the entrance into non-duality." So that sounds pretty good, right? Thereupon, the Lichavi Vimalakirti kept his silence, nothing at all. So, I skipped the intro there. So we have all given our teaching, noble sir. Now may you elucidate the teaching of the entrance into the principle of non-duality. So thereupon, Vimalakirti just saying nothing. The Crown Prince Manjushri applauded Vimalakirti. Excellent, excellent, noble sir. This is indeed the entrance into the non-duality of the bodhisattvas. Here, there is no use for symbols, sounds, and ideas. Teaching bodhisattvas entered the door of the Dharma of non-duality and the birth of things. So I think that is probably the root of all of these kind of stories about not saying anything. And obviously there we also see Manjushri's leaking again. So he's explaining that we need to be silent rather than just being silent. So let's see. Well, I think that's probably a good place to conclude for the day. I have some more stuff, but we've already gone on long enough, I think. So maybe we can have some discussion based on this. So does anyone have any thoughts, ideas about?
Actually, I have a question.
Yes.
Mostly I want to connect with you outside of this because I'm about to go down a rabbit hole and nobody but me is going to care.
Okay.
But the Indic script still used within Shingon, do you know what it's used for?
I think that they mostly use it for like various ceremonial things, like mantras especially, and they'll write them on these sticks and throw them into fires and so forth. I don't really know Shingon very well, but yeah.
That's good, because while you were saying that, it suddenly occurred to me there's a particular way we notate shomyo, which is like the oldest kind of chanting, and my guess is goes all the way back to Sanskrit, maybe Vedic, I don't know. And it's not like hiragana, it's not like Western notation, it's not like Hakase, it's not like anything else. It's very kind of flowing. And I didn't make the connection until you said that, because of course there's a strong Shingon influence in Zen.
Yeah.
It's syncretic with a lot of things, and that's very exciting because I have never been able to really figure out how that's done. It seems a bit intuitive about what the melodic line is, but it's not entirely. And it looks like this weird hybrid.
Yeah.
It's sort of a very cursive hiragana and something else. And I'll bet you that's a direct connection. So outside of here, maybe I'll pick your brain. I don't want to take people's time because nobody will care but me. But that's a really interesting connection because, for instance, one of the places we typically use shomyo is at Ryakusatsu, which is the oldest ceremony we still do.
Yeah.
So I'll bet you that's like how that's still alive. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's a really interesting story. So the script that is used in Japan is called Siddham. And actually some of the Indian languages that are widely spoken today, their particular scripts are direct descendants of it, but that script itself has died out except in Japan, which is kind of weird.
Interesting. Okay, so, I may pick your brain outside of here. I don't want to take this time, but thank you for that. It made me think.
Other thoughts, questions?
When you were talking about negative theology, and one of my favorite texts in that tradition is The Cloud of Unknowing.
Oh, I don't know.
And you don't know that?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, I'll explain real quick.
Lots of things I don't know.
Actually, I don't know how old it is exactly, but it was circulated among monasteries. And the concept of the cloud of unknowing is that anything you think you know about God is not God. Right? You said that. Which also reminded me of the Upanishads when they talk about not this, not that methodology. And that's sort of like that methodology applied to Christian theology. Whereas to know God, you have to pass through the cloud of unknowing. You have to forget everything you think you know about God, and then God is there. So you might consider that.
Yeah, I think that's a good corollary with Zazen. Zazen is the cloud of unknowing.
Father Kennedy Roshi, he's within the Mizumi circle. He was Dharma transmission glassman. He's a Catholic priest who teaches Zen, and this is one of the texts he likes is the cloud of unknowing, because it does seem to be the closest thing Christianity has gotten to what we do here.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of interesting parallels between those two. But yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I'll look it up.
It's about the 1300s.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's right.
Anyone else? Move to the gallery. Anybody have a question online? Comments?
I guess I should add that, I apologize that it was a little bit philosophy heavy today, but I did, this text was presented in my introduction to Buddhism class that I took, or actually I was a teaching assistant for at IU when I was in grad school there. And it's kind of unfortunate, I think, sometimes how there isn't much crossover between the Tibetan tradition and our own, because they have a lot of texts that we don't have, and we have a lot of texts that they don't have, and but of course they're very applicable to either side. So the professor, presented this as sort of the ultimate kind of distillation of the perfection of wisdom literature, and I just thought it was really cool, so I wanted to present it to you all today.
I'm going to try and form a question.
Sure.
Because this is rolling around in my head, and it has been for a long time, ever since the first time I heard it and the way I think about it, and it becomes more convoluted the more I think about it. And it's actually sounds kind of glib when you first hear it. But enlightenment is the biggest disappointment to your ego.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just thought I'd throw that out there and see if you want to tackle it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think sort of by definition, right?
Yeah.
Because anything that can disappoint someone, implies that there's an ego there, and of course, awakening is sort of the ultimate realization of no self. So by definition, it has to be a major disappointment to the ego. The ultimate, unsurpassable disappointment to the ego. So yeah, I think that makes sense to me.
Thank you.
Not that I've succeeded in getting there yet, but hopefully I'll be disappointed one day.
Well put. Is there anyone else?
Yes.
How would you characterize, as time, you were just talking about disappointment and expectation. So our condition short of enlightenment is a kind of sliding back and forth between when we realize and then we're back into the trip of it again.
Yeah,
Is
that's.
that fair?
I think that the answer to that really depends on which tradition you practice in and sort of the opinion of the particular tradition, and also maybe even individual group. But I think the way that awakening was traditionally understood was it was sort of a final one-time thing. You practice for eons and eons, and finally this thing happens. And in the earliest conception, you're simply not reborn anymore. So in that sense, it's truly final. But as the tradition evolved, that kind of concept went away more and more, and this idea of samsara and nirvana being one became kind of mainstream in the Mahayana tradition. And once you've done that, it's hard to speak of sort of a final extinction from reality, because if samsara, the world that we live in with all its problems, is already nirvana, there's no place to leave and go to. And I think that in our tradition in particular, this idea of, kind of oscillating a little bit between the two realms comes up. So Sawaki Roshi, Hojo-san's teacher's teacher, has this teaching where he says that when we behave like a Buddha, we're expressing our Buddha nature, but when we behave like a thief, we're expressing our thief nature. And of course, most of the time we're expressing our thief nature because we're like, how do I serve this thing here? But sometimes when we sit down and do zazen, Buddha nature manifests in that moment. Unfortunately, when we get back up, we're usually right back to thief nature again. But through zazen, we can enter that realm of Buddha nature. At least that's the way that I understand it. So I think that that's one of the things that makes this tradition a little bit special. Is it's not so grandiose. We don't have this sense of, achieving some ultimate final thing. It's already right here, and to the extent that we kind of dedicate ourselves and take it seriously, we can participate in it anytime. So. Mm-hmm.
Reminds you of Suzuki Roshi said, "There's no such thing as an enlightened person. There's only enlightened action."
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that it expresses it very well. Anything else today?
Let's close.